Tylen Vasquez had worked at the border station for 11 years. In all that time, he had never seen a reading he couldn't explain. He was a sensor officer, and sensor officers did not panic. They read numbers, they checked data, they filed reports. That was the job, and Tylen was very good at it. The Sentinel's crest was an Imperial border station hovering on the very edge of Viagor space. It was old. The metal walls had a greenish tint from age, and the lamps hummed in a way that no one had ever bothered to fix. The station watched over the neutral corridor, a wide strip of empty space separating the Vioran Galactic Empire from the wild, uncharted territories beyond. Nothing interesting had ever emerged from the neutral corridor. That was what everyone said. That was what everyone believed until today. Tylen was finishing his third cup of tonic tea when his console emitted a sound. It was an unusual sound. The standard alert was a quiet chime, signifying that a cargo ship or a lost freighter had strayed too close to the border. This sound was deeper, longer. It was the sound the system made when something very large dropped out of subspace. He set down his tea and looked at the screen. The first thing he noticed was the mass reading. It was gargantuan. The number on his screen looked like someone's idea of a joke. He blinked, stared, leaned closer. The object that had just emerged from subspace possessed the mass of a dreadnought-class warship. That was impossible. No one built dreadnoughts anymore. The Empire hadn't built them for over 1,000 years because there was nothing in the galaxy that required that much firepower. And the second thing he noticed was the energy output. It was the figure that made him set his tea down very carefully and sit up very straight in his chair. The energy readings were 6 times higher than those of any ship in the Imperial fleet. 6 times. Not 2, not 3, 6. Tylen did what any good sensor officer would do. He assumed his equipment was broken. He initiated a full calibration of his sensor array. It took 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, he told himself that the border station was old. The equipment was old. And old equipment sometimes gave false readings. It was normal. It was fine. There couldn't be anything out there that could produce such numbers. Nothing in the known galaxy. The calibration ended. He ran the scan again. The numbers remained the same. His hand reached for the communication panel, and he pressed the button leading to Commander Salone's cabin. It was the middle of the night cycle, and he knew she wouldn't be pleased about being woken up. But Tylen had a rule. When the numbers didn't make sense, you reported it to someone higher in rank. That way, when everything went wrong, it would be their problem. Commander Salone arrived on the sensor deck 12 minutes later. She was a Chalite, which meant she was tall, thin, and covered in a hard carapace that clicked as she walked. She had 4 arms, and she used all of them to express her displeasure at being woken. "This had better be worth my sleep, Vasquez," she said. Her voice was like the rustle of dry leaves. "I'm not sure what it's worth, Commander," Tylen said. He pointed to his screen. "But I've checked the readings twice." Salone leaned over his shoulder. She remained silent for a long time. Tylen could hear her mandibles clicking, which meant she was thinking or angry. With Chalites, it was hard to tell. "Run a full spectral analysis," Salone said. "I want to know what this thing is made of." Tylen ran the analysis. The results came in parts, and each part made the situation even stranger. The unknown ship's hull was made of steel-titanium alloy, which was primitive. No advanced species had used steel for eons, but over the steel was a layer of carbon nanotube weave of exceptional density, and beneath that was what? The database couldn't identify it. The computer labeled it an unknown crystalline lattice and offered no further explanation. "Steel," Salone uttered. She said the word as if it had an unpleasant taste. "So, who builds a warship out of steel? Who? Who starts with steel and keeps building on top of it?" Tylen said quietly. Salone looked at him. She didn't like that answer. It didn't like it because it implied something she wasn't ready to think about. A species that started with primitive materials and layered advanced technology on top of them was a species that had evolved very quickly. "Has it transmitted anything?" she asked. "Not yet." "Wait," Tylen's console chimed again. "The ship's transponder is syncing with our translation systems." They watched the screen together. The translation software processed the signal, converting the unknown language into galactic common. It was crude. The grammar was wrong in several places, but the message was clear enough. "UNS Prometheus, United Earth Navy, we request an open dialogue." Salone read the message 3 times. Then she turned to the junior officer standing behind them. "Load the species registry. Search for tyrants." The junior officer was a young Vori with nervous eyes. He quickly found the file in the database. It was small. Most species files were lengthy. This one was tiny because there wasn't much to say about civilizations that hadn't left their planet yet. Tyrants, the junior officer read aloud, also known as humans. Home planet, Earth. Solar system, outer territories. Classification, level 9. Pre-spaceflight primitives. Last assessment, 197 standard years ago. Technology level at time of assessment. Chemical propulsion rockets. Burning fossil fuels. Early nuclear fission. Note: species demonstrates moderate intelligence but is heavily divided into competing nations. No unified government. No capability for spaceflight. Estimated time to spaceflight: 400 to 600 years. The sensor deck was very quiet. After this, Tylen looked at the mass readings on his screen. He looked at the energy output. He looked at the transponder signal that read United Earth Navy. Then he looked at the file that said pre-spaceflight primitive. "This cannot be a human warship," Salone said. She said it simply, as if stating a fact. "The sky is blue, water is wet." It couldn't be a human warship because humans didn't have warships. Humans had barely learned to leave their own atmosphere when they were last checked. The idea that they had built something that produced 6 times more energy than an Imperial flagship wasn't just unlikely, it was absurd. "Run the scan again," Salone commanded. Tylen ran the scan again. Yes, this was the 3rd time. The numbers didn't change. They never changed. The object in the neutral corridor was real. It was massive, and it was broadcasting a human identifier. "I need to contact the 9th Fleet," Salone said. She straightened up, and her carapace clicked in a way that meant she had made a decision. Admiral Zaire had to see this. Admiral Kaus Zaire was the commander of the 9th Expansionist Fleet, and he was exactly the kind of man Tylen didn't want in this situation. Zaire was old, even by Vioran standards. His scales had faded from green to dull gray, and his eyes had the look of a man who had spent too many years being right about everything and had forgotten what it was like to be wrong. He was a chauvinist in the old imperial tradition. He believed that Viorans were the greatest species the galaxy had ever produced, and considered every other species to exist somewhere on a scale between useful and insignificant. He probably hadn't thought about humans at all. The communication was brief. Salone transmitted the sensor data, the transponder signal, and the spectral analysis. She explained that she had verified the readings multiple times and that the data appeared to be accurate. Admiral Zaire's response arrived 14 minutes later. He laughed. Tylen heard it in the audio message. The old admiral was actually laughing. "Commander Salone," Zaire said, and in his voice, it sounded as if he were explaining something obvious to a child. "I have reviewed your sensor data. What you have discovered is most likely a relic to which some primitive species has attached an oversized reactor. The energy readings are impressive, I admit, but energy is not capability. Fire burns hot, but it does not think. These humans, if it is indeed them, have likely built themselves a very large, very loud toy and are now flying it around the galaxy, hoping that someone will be impressed." There was a pause in the message. Then Zaire continued. "I am sending Patrol Group 7 to intercept. 12 Kothari-class cruisers should be more than enough to escort these primitives back to whatever corner of space they crawled out of. If they resist, Commander Wynne has my permission to use appropriate measures. This matter requires no further attention from this command." Zaire ended the transmission. Salone stood for a long time, very still. Tylen watched her and didn't speak. He didn't look at the spectral analysis. "No," Salone finally said. "No, Commander," Tylen agreed. He didn't. The crystalline lattice in the hull, the layering of defensive signatures, the reactor output. "No, Commander." Salone turned to the viewport. Through the thick glass, they saw nothing but the stars. Prometheus, somewhere out there, too far to see with the naked eye, but very real, very waiting. 12 cruisers, Salone said. She said it the way someone might say 12 paper boats before a storm. Tylen looked at his console again. The unknown ship's energy readings had been slowly and steadily rising since its arrival. At first, he too thought it was a sensor error, but it wasn't an error. The ship was powering up. Whatever systems it had been using in low power mode, it was now engaging. The numbers climbed higher and higher, and Tylen realized with a cold feeling in his stomach that what they were seeing was a ship at rest, idling, sleeping. Now it was waking up. Somewhere out there in the darkness between the stars, 12 Vioran cruisers were making the jump into the neutral corridor. Their crews were likely joking about the mission. Patrol duty for some stray primitives. Easy work. Perhaps they would be back for the evening meal. Tylan picked up his cup. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway because he had a hunch that the night would be a very long one. On his screen, the energy readings continued to rise. Prometheus waited. Wynn and Patrol Group 7 had no idea where they were flying. In the halls of the Sentinel's crest, Commander Salone returned to her quarters. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall, thinking of a species that had gone from burning dead plants for fuel to building a ship that made the entire Imperial fleet look like children's toys. She thought about how they had done it in less than 200 years. She thought about what kind of species could do that. And then she thought about what kind of fear could have driven them to do it. She didn't sleep all night, and in the morning, when reports started coming in from the neutral corridor, she was not surprised. She wasn't surprised at all because she had checked the readings herself, and the readings were very, very clear. The Empire was not prepared for what was coming, not even close. Patrol Commander X-Wing stood on the bridge of the Fang of Dominance and felt good. He was young for a patrol commander. His scales were still bright green and his eyes sharp and hungry. He had earned his rank through ambition and political connections in equal measure, and he wore his uniform as if it had been tailored specifically for his body. In his thoughts, he was already an admiral. He just needed the right moment to prove it. This mission, he thought. Not the moment, but it was easy duty. And easy duty still looked good on a service record. 12 Kothari-class cruisers of Patrol Group 7 dropped out of subspace in perfect formation. This was something Wynn had spent months honing with his crews. The formation was flawless. 12 ships, each 1 kilometer long, arranged in a standard circular pattern. Their hulls were smooth and dark purple, and their plasma spears glowed with a faint blue light along the weapon rails. They were beautiful ships. Wynn loved looking at them. He loved knowing that each of them carried enough firepower to burn a small moon to bare rock. "All ships ready, Commander," his communications officer said. "Good," Wynn said. He folded his hands behind his back and looked at the main viewport. "Where is our guest?" The sensor officer pointed to the screen. Ahead of them was a single contact, sitting motionless in the empty space of the neutral corridor. It was just a dot on the sensor display. A blip, nothing special. "Open a channel," Wynn said. Standard Imperial warning. He cleared his throat and spoke in his most commanding voice. "Unidentified vessel, this is Patrol Commander X-Wing of the Vioran Imperial Navy. You have entered restricted space. You are ordered to power down your weapons, transmit your navigation logs, and prepare to be escorted from this sector. Failure to comply will be met with force. You have 60 seconds to respond." He was proud of how that sounded. He had practiced it. The seconds ticked by. Wynn waited. His bridge crew waited. 40 seconds passed, and then the communications officer spoke. "Commander," the ship is responding. Audio and video to the main screen. The main display flickered, and then it showed something Wynn had never seen before. It was a face, a human face. It belonged to a woman who seemed to be somewhere in her middle years, although with an alien species it was hard to tell. She had dark hair pulled tightly back, dark skin, and a thin scar running from her left eyebrow down to her cheek. Her eyes were calm, not frightened, not angry, just calm, like deep water. "This is Captain Lena Vasquez of the United Nations Prometheus. United Earth Navy," the woman said. Her galactic common was better than the transponder signal had suggested, though she spoke with a strange, firm accent. "We are on a peaceful diplomatic mission to the High Conclave of Vioran. We bear no hostile intent. We request passage and an audience with your government." Wynn stared at her. She didn't look like he had expected. He wasn't sure what he had expected. "Here is the file," he said. "Humans. Soft-skinned, mammals, no natural armor, no claws, no venom glands, and no biological advantages worth noting." This woman had none of those things, but in her eyes was something that made Wynn uncomfortable. It was the look of a person who had seen violence and had long ago come to terms with it. "Your request is denied," Wynn said. "You will power down and submit to escort. This is non-negotiable." "I understand your position, Commander," Vasquez said, "but I am forced to respectfully refuse. We have come a very long way, and we will not be turning back. I would prefer to resolve this through negotiation." Wynn felt a flash of irritation. He wasn't used to being told no. He opened his mouth to reply, but his sensor officer interrupted him. "Commander," the officer said. His voice sounded different now. "Lower. I have visual contact with the target." Putting it on the secondary display, the second screen lit up with a magnified image of the human ship, and all sound on the bridge ceased. Prometheus was enormous. Its length was 4 kilometers. Wynne slowly processed this number because it didn't make sense. His own ship, the Fang of Dominance, was 1.2 kilometers long. Prometheus was nearly 4 times longer. It hung in space like a mountain that someone had carved into the shape of a weapon. Its hull was angular and rigid, with sharp edges and flat planes, giving it the look of something built for one purpose and one purpose only. There were no smooth curves, no elegant lines. It was brutal. It was honest about what it was, and it was covered in weapons. Thousands of them. Turret batteries were arranged across the surface of the hull in neat, terrifying rows. Missile launchers, point defense clusters, and along the ridge of the ship, a row of larger guns whose purpose Wynne could not identify, but whose size caused a cold, empty feeling in his stomach. "This is impossible," Wynne whispered. "Commander," said the sensor officer, and now his voice was trembling slightly. "I am reading layered shielding around the vessel, multiple overlapping energy barriers. Our records indicate that layered shielding is a theoretical concept. No species has ever deployed it successfully. And their reactor, stellar thermonuclear fusion, Commander. The reactor output is approximately 6 times that of our most powerful flagship." The bridge was quiet. There were 1,200 crew members across 12 ships, and no one made a sound. Wynne looked at Prometheus on his screen. He looked at his 12 cruisers positioned around it in perfect formation. He felt like a man who had come to a fight with a knife, only to find that his opponent had brought a volcano. But he had his orders. Admiral Djur had authorized the use of force, and X-Wing hadn't come this far to fail. "All ships," he said, his voice tense and firm. "Full broadside volley, all fire." 12 Kothari-class cruisers fired everything they had. Plasma spears at full power, kinetic accelerators, missile batteries. The cumulative firepower of Patrol Group 7 was enough to crack a planet's crust. The void between the cruisers and Prometheus turned white with energy, and for a moment, no one saw anything. Then the light faded. Prometheus remained untouched. Its shields shimmered faintly, like the surface of a lake after a pebble had been dropped into it. Nothing more, and then the ship moved. It shouldn't have moved the way it did. It was 4 kilometers long and had the mass of a small asteroid. Ships of that size move slowly and purposefully, like great beasts turning in deep water. That was how physics worked. That was how the universe worked. Prometheus paid no attention to any of that. It accelerated so fast that half of the patrol group's sensor displays glitched trying to track it. One moment it was in front of the formation, the next it was weaving between the cruisers, threading through the encirclement like a fish sliding between stones in a stream. The point defense turrets on its hull swatted away incoming missiles without visible effort, as a human might brush crumbs off a table. The remaining plasma beams bent around the ship's shield geometry and dissipated into nothing. The entire skirmish lasted 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, Prometheus had relocated to the center of the formation, surrounding all 12 cruisers, and hadn't fired a single shot. It simply showed them that it could go wherever it wanted, and there was nothing they could do about it. On the bridge of the Fang of Dominance, Wynne gripped the railing in front of him so hard that his claws left marks on the metal. "Commander," said the sensor officer, his voice becoming very flat. That was what happened when someone's brain decided that emotions were no longer needed. Their shields are at 97%. Our entire barrage reduced their shield integrity by 3%. 3%. 12 warships, all their weapons, 3%. On Prometheus, Commander Deshi Okafor stood at the tactical post and watched the sensor data with the same expression a human might have while reading a mildly interesting weather forecast. He was a tall man with dark skin and short-cropped gray hair. He had personally developed the combat doctrine of Prometheus and had spent years running simulations against all types of alien weapon systems they had managed to study. This skirmish had gone almost exactly as his models predicted. Imperial weapons were energetic but crude, built for suppression through volume rather than precision. Against Prometheus's adaptive shield matrix, it was meaningless. "They can't hurt us," Okafor said to Vasquez. Vasquez was still sitting in her command chair. She hadn't stood up during the entire skirmish. She hadn't raised her voice. She had watched 12 alien warships throw everything they had at her ship, and she felt nothing but sadness. She hadn't come here to fight. She had come to talk, but the conversation required the other side to understand who they were talking to. One turret, Vasquez said. "Forward battery 7. Lowest power setting. Lowest power confirmed," Okafor said. He entered the command. A single turret on the forward hull of Prometheus turned and locked onto the fang of dominance. It was one of the smaller turrets, not even a main battery, the type of weapon Prometheus used for point defense against fighters and missiles. Okafor set it to the absolute minimum power, which was approximately 1% of the weapon's total power. It fired. A beam of blue-white light, perfectly focused and incredibly precise, pierced the space between the two ships. It struck the fang of dominance dead center. The beam didn't explode, didn't scatter. It cut. It sliced through the cruiser's hull like a hot wire through soft wax, cleanly cutting the ship into two halves. The cut was so precise that the emergency bulkheads on both halves of the ship activated perfectly. The atmosphere was sealed, the power systems on both halves remained operational. Artificial gravity held. Not a single crew member died. Not a single crew member was even injured. The fang of dominance was split in two, and it was done with the care of a surgeon performing an operation. Wynne found himself drifting in the forward half of his ship. The bridge was running on emergency power, the lights were red. Through the viewport behind him, he could see the rear of his ship slowly drifting away. The edge of the cut glowed dully with residual heat. It was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing he had ever seen. The comms system was still working. Captain Vasquez's voice filled the bridge. "Humanity does not want war," she said. Her voice was just as it had always been calm, even like a river that could not be moved. "But we will no longer be an object of study, cataloging, and neglect. We have looked at the stars for a long time. Now we are here. Take us to your conclave." No one aboard any of the 12 ships said a word. There was nothing to say. They had fired everything they had, and they had achieved nothing. In return, the humans had fired once on minimum power from a point defense turret and sliced a cruiser in half without killing anyone. The message was clear. It was the loudest silence the galaxy had ever heard. Wynne drifted on his ruined bridge and looked out the viewport. Prometheus hung in space behind the glass, massive and dark and patient. Its weapons were off. Its shields still shimmered faintly. It was waiting. It could afford to wait. It had all the time in the universe. He reached for his communication panel with a hand that didn't feel like his own. His claws were trembling. His whole body was trembling. He opened a channel to Admiral Ziur's flagship and spoke 3 words that would change galactic history. "Send everyone. Now." Then he closed the channel and sat in the red emergency light of his broken ship, trying to understand what had just happened. 200 years. That was how long it had taken humans. 200 years from burning dead plants to this. To a ship that treated the best weapons in the galaxy like rain against a window. What kind of species could do that? And, more importantly, what kind of species would choose not to use that power for destruction? Prometheus could have destroyed all 12 cruisers in seconds. Wynne knew that now with absolute certainty, but it hadn't. It had sliced his ship in half with the precision of a teacher drawing a line on a chalkboard. It had made a point, and then it had stopped. That terrified Wynne more than anything else, because a species that built such weapons and then chose restraint was much more dangerous than a species that simply attacked. Attackers were predictable, their limits were visible, but a species that could utterly destroy you and chose not to you could never know their limits. You could never know when they might change their mind. Prometheus waited in the darkness, and somewhere far away, Admiral Ziur was receiving the message. He would listen to it. He would hear the fear in Wynne's voice. And for the first time in a very long career, the old admiral would understand that the universe was not what he had imagined it to be. It was much, much larger than that. And humans were in it now. The high conclave of the Vioran Galactic Empire sat in a chamber that was older than most civilizations. It had been built in the heart of the capital world, Vior Prime, carved from a single piece of living crystal that grew and changed with the centuries. The walls glowed with a soft amber light. The ceiling was so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it. 1,000 seats were arranged in a large circle, and in those seats sat representatives of 100 species that had built an empire stretching across 3 galactic arms. They were afraid. No one said it aloud. These were diplomats, generals, and governors. And such people did not admit to fear, but it was in the room like a scent that could not be washed away. 3 days had passed since Patrol Group 7 had been neutralized in the neutral corridor. And in those 3 days, the news had spread through all the Empire's communication networks. A human warship, one ship, It had brushed off the combined firepower of 12 cruisers and then sliced one of them in half with a weapon set to minimum power. The sensor data had been checked 17 times. No one believed it the first time, or the second, or the fifth. By the 17th check, disbelief had turned into something much worse. Admiral Zayur had mobilized the entire 9th Expansionist fleet. 800 warships now blocked the neutral corridor. Their weapons were hot, and their crews were nervous. But Prometheus did not move. It sat in space like a stone in a river, letting the current flow around it, unmoving and unmoved. And then the humans sent a shuttle. Conclave Speaker Orfman stood in the center of the large chamber and watched as the human ambassador entered the aisle. Orf was a Dravati, which meant he looked like a tree that had decided to start walking. He was ancient. His tree-like bark was cracked with age, and his branch-like arms moved slowly, as if each gesture cost him effort. He had led the conclave for 400 years, and in all that time, he had never seen the chamber so quiet. The human ambassador, a woman named Alina Zhao, was small by the standards of most species in the room. She had black hair touched with gray, and she wore a simple dark uniform with no medals or awards. She walked with the straight posture of a person who had been a soldier before she became a diplomat. 2 human guards walked behind her. Both were tall and silent, and with sharp eyes, they watched everything. Zhao reached the center of the chamber and stopped. She looked over the 1,000 faces looking down at her. Reptilians, insectoids, crystalline faces, faces of species that had traveled between the stars when humans were still living in caves. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look aggressive. She looked like a person who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "My name is Alina Zhao," she said. Her voice was clear and carried easily across the vast chamber. "I am here as a representative of the Tyrant United Government and the 7 billion people of Earth. I carry a message, and I carry a gift." She held up a small object. It was a crystal the size of a fist, and it glowed with a faint blue light. "This is a data crystal," Zhao said. "It contains a complete technical description of the ship your fleet encountered 3 days ago, Prometheus. It also contains a complete overview of the current military capabilities of the United Earth Navy. We give you this information freely and without conditions." A murmur ran through the chamber. Speaker Orf raised a branch-like hand, and the room went quiet again. "Before your analysts review this data," Zhao continued, "I would like to tell you a story. I think it will help you understand what you are about to see." She paused, took a breath, and then told it. 197 years ago, a Vioran research ship, Silent Observer, completed its mission to catalog the Sol system. It spent 14 days scanning Earth, recording data on population, technology levels, air quality, and cultural development. It classified humans as Level 9 primitives pre-spaceflight and moved on. It was routine. Viorans had cataloged thousands of primitive species. Humans were nothing special, but Silent Observer made a mistake. Upon leaving Earth's orbit, one of its secondary scanning probes malfunctioned and fell into the planet's atmosphere. It crashed in the Pacific Ocean at a depth of 4 kilometers, a trench no human had ever reached. It lay there for 6 years before a deep-sea research vessel accidentally found it. The governments of Earth didn't know what they had found, not at first. The probe was damaged, and its technologies were so far beyond anything humans had ever built that it might have seemed like magic. But humans had a quality that the Vioran observation report had failed to identify. The report spoke of moderate intelligence. What it should have said was relentless, obsessive, terrified intelligence. Because the probe told humans something that changed everything. They were not alone, and the beings with whom they shared the galaxy were so far ahead of them that the gap was almost meaningless. It was like an ant discovering the existence of giants. An ant couldn't fight the giants. An ant couldn't hide from the giants. An ant could only hope the giants never decided to step on it. Humans didn't accept that. A single scientific body was created in total secrecy. It was called the Black Vault Program and was the largest and most ambitious project in human history. Every major nation on Earth contributed scientists, engineers, resources. For the first time, an entire species worked together toward a single goal. The goal was survival. The head of the Black Vault Program was a man named Arab Misra. He was a physicist from a country called India. And he was the kind of person who looked at an impossible problem and simply refused to accept that it was impossible. He gathered the brightest minds on the planet and gave them one instruction: take this alien technology apart, understand it, and then build something better. They didn't just reverse engineer the probe. For most species, that would have been enough. They would have learned how the alien technology worked and then built copies. That would have been logical. But humans were not logical. Humans were afraid. Fear did something to the human mind that Mizra hadn't expected. It didn't make them cautious. It made them creative. Every element of the alien technology they extracted from the probe, they looked at not as a solution, but as a starting point. They looked at the design of the Vioran plasma reactor and said, "This is clever, but it's not enough." They looked at the subspace engine blueprints and said, "This works, but it's too slow." They looked at the hull alloy composition and said, "This is strong, but it will break." And then they made them better. In 40 years, they reached the technology level of the probe. In 80 years, they surpassed it. In 120 years, they developed technologies that the probe's creators could never have imagined. The stellar thermonuclear fusion reactor was a human invention. No other species had achieved it when they took the concept of plasma containment and pushed it until they could hold a piece of a star in a magnetic bubble the size of a room. The hull's crystalline lattice was a human invention. They grew it in orbital labs, molecule by molecule, creating a material that was harder than anything in nature and could self-repair when damaged. The layered shield matrix was a human invention. Every species in the galaxy used single-layer energy shields. Viorans assumed multiple overlapping shields might be possible, but the math never worked. Human mathematicians made the math work. They did it in a university on a chalkboard, and the woman who solved the equation was 26 years old. And they did all this in silence. No transmissions, no expansion, no colonies, no signals. For 200 years, humanity hid. They built their fleet in the icy darkness of the Oort cloud, a vast shell of ice and rock surrounding their solar system, so far from the sun that no one would think to look there. They trained their crews, they tested their weapons, they prepared, and they waited. Zhao finished her story, and the chamber went quiet. No one moved, no one spoke. 1,000 representatives of 100 species sat in their ancient seats and tried to comprehend what they had just been told. Speaker Orf was the first to speak. His voice was low and raspy, like wind blowing in an old tree. "You tell us," he said slowly, "that your species went from chemical rockets to star-class warships in less than 200 years. "Yes," Zhao said. "That is impossible. And yet, I am here." Orf was silent for a moment. Then he signaled to the conclave's chief analyst, a Vioran scientist named Korit, who had been studying the data crystal on a portable console. Korit looked up. His face was the color of old paper. "The data is confirmed," Korit said. His voice broke on the last word. "Prometheus. One ship in a fleet of 300 dreadnoughts of similar power. The United Earth Navy also has about 4,000 smaller vessels, including destroyers, frigates, and fast attack craft." He paused. He looked at his console. He looked up again. Based on the provided technical specifications, any single Terran dreadnought could engage and defeat our entire Ninth Fleet. He paused. "Any of them," he repeated. "There are 300. The chamber erupted. 1,000 voices speaking simultaneously in a dozen languages. They were all saying the same thing in different words. "This cannot be. This must be a deception. This must be a trick." But it was not a deception. The data was open. The specifications were detailed. The humans had given them everything, down to the reactor schematics and weapon frequencies. They had hidden nothing, and that frightened Speaker Orf the most, because a species that hides its strength is a species that fears detection, but a species that openly demonstrates its strength. That is a species that fears nothing. He raised his hands, and the chamber fell silent again. "Ambassador Zhao," Orf said, "I must ask you the question that I believe everyone in this chamber is thinking. You have built the most powerful military force the galaxy has ever seen. You did this in secret, in silence, in the dark. And now you come to us and show us everything and say that you want peace." He leaned forward. His ancient eyes were deep and dark, searching. "If you have such power," he said, "why did you come with peace? Why didn't you just take what you wanted? You could have burned our worlds. You could have crushed our fleets. You could have destroyed our empire in one campaign. Why are you here, in this chamber, asking for dialogue?" Elena Zhao was silent for a moment. She looked down at her hands. Then she looked up at the old Dravati, the speaker, and when she spoke, her voice had changed. It was softer, not weaker, just more honest than before. Because we know what it's like to be lonely and afraid, she said. We built all of this because we were afraid of you. Every ship, every weapon, every piece of technology we developed came from one place: fear. We looked at the stars and saw an empire that was 12,000 years old and had cataloged us like insects in a jar. We didn't know if you would come back. We didn't know if you would decide that our planet was useful, but our species wasn't. So we built. We built until we were sure that nothing in this galaxy could threaten us anymore. She paused. But we didn't build all of this to destroy you. We built this so we could stand before you as equals and say what I am about to say. She looked around the chamber again. No species in this galaxy should ever again have to look at the stars and feel the way we felt: lonely, afraid, wondering if anyone cares whether we live or die. We built a wall around ourselves because we had no choice. Now, we are here to ensure that no one else ever builds such a wall again, including you. The chamber fell silent again. But this was a different silence. The first silence was shock. This silence was something else. It was the silence of 1,000 people rethinking everything they knew. In the back of the chamber, in a private booth intended for military observers, sat Admiral Kaus Zayar. He had listened to the entire session through a secure relay. On the console before him was the complete technical description of the data crystal. He had read every page. He had checked every number. His hands lay on the console. They were trembling. Deer was old. He had commanded fleets for longer than most species lived. He had won battles, suppressed rebellions, and asserted the Empire's will across 1,000 star systems. He had never feared anything. Fear was for lesser species. Fear was for the young, the weak, and the unprepared. But now he feared not the human ships, nor their weapons, shields, or impossible reactors. He feared because he understood something that perhaps no one else in the chamber could grasp. She had said they built all this out of fear. And Zyor knew what fear could do to a species. He had used fear as a weapon his entire career. He had seen what frightened species were capable of when pushed into a corner, but he had never seen a species that was frightened by the entire galaxy. Zyor had never seen a species that looked at the universe itself and said, "We will not be victims." He had never seen a species that turned its horror into something that could make an empire tremble. He looked at the technical specifications one more time. 300 dreadnoughts. 4,000 support ships, reactor technologies his own engineers couldn't even understand, weapons that could slice a cruiser in half on minimum power, and they had done it in 200 years, while his empire had reached its current level 12,000 years ago and had stopped developing because there was nothing left to develop into. His hands didn't stop trembling. Quietly, without telling anyone, he opened a comms channel to the Ninth Fleet. His voice was steady, even if his hands were shaking. "Old habits," he said. "All ships, stand down from combat readiness. Disengage weapons. Return to standard patrol formation. This is not a drill." He gave no reason. He didn't explain himself. He simply gave the order, closed the channel, and sat in the dark booth, listening as Ambassador Zhao began to discuss the terms of a new relationship between humanity and the galaxy. And far away, in the cold silence of the neutral corridor, Prometheus waited, patient, quiet. Its weapons were dark. Its shields hummed softly. A fortress built by frightened children who had grown up and decided that power without mercy was no power at all. The stars shone around it, and for the first time in 12,000 years, the galaxy held its breath. In the weeks following Ambassador Zhao's address to the High Conclave, the Vioran Galactic Empire did what all large organizations did when faced with something they couldn't control. It argued with itself. The Conclave split into factions overnight. Some wanted an alliance, some wanted isolation, some wanted to pretend humans didn't exist, hoping that would make it their reality. And some wanted war. Counselor Vet School wanted war more than anyone else. School was a Vioran, pure-blooded and proud. He had been a general before he became a politician and still wore his military medals on his ceremonial conclave robes because he wanted everyone to remember that he had earned his seat through blood, not speeches. He was tall for his species, with scales that had faded from age to a deep bronze, and he had the voice of a man accustomed to obedience. He stood before the conclave on the 7th day after first contact and laid out his argument. "You are all deceived," he said. He never softened his words. "Humans come to us with a smile and an outstretched hand, and you reach out to take it, like children accepting sweets from a stranger. Think, why would any species reveal its full military power to a potential enemy? There is only one reason. Because they are hiding something greater. What they have shown us is what they want us to see. What they have not shown us is what should frighten you. A murmur rolled through the chamber. Skull continued. 200 years ago, they were animals burning dead plants for heat. Now they have a fleet that can destroy us. What will they have in 200 years? In 500? In 1,000? Every day we do not act, they become stronger. Every day the gap between us grows. If we want to survive, we must strike now, while their numbers are still finite and their territory is still small. It was a strong argument. It was also, in a cold and logical sense, not entirely wrong. Several members of the conclave nodded. The fear that Skull was selling was easy to buy because it was the same fear many of them already felt. Speaker Orff listened to it all from his seat in the center of the chamber. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. When Skull finished, Orff noted the point and moved to the next item on the agenda, which was the issue of cultural exchange. Because while politicians argued about war and peace, something else was happening. Something no one expected. Something that would prove to be far more powerful than any weapon the humans had built. Humans had begun sharing their culture. It started as part of the diplomatic process. Standard first contact protocols between species included the exchange of cultural data, language files, historical records, and scientific knowledge. All species did it. It was usually boring. Viorans had done it 1,000 times with 1,000 species and had never found anything surprising. Culture is culture. Every species had art, music, and stories. Some were better than others. None were extraordinary. Human culture was extraordinary. The first sign of trouble was when the Conclave's Cultural Analysis Department began reviewing human music files. A junior analyst named Pred was assigned to catalog the materials. He was Vioran, young, bored, and expected the task to take half a day. It took him 3 weeks, and by the end, he hadn't slept normally for days. The problem was the volume. Humans hadn't sent a representative sample of their music. They had sent everything. Millennia of musical development, from simple drum beats to orchestral compositions of astonishing complexity. Pred listened to a piece called Symphony No. 9 by a human named Beethoven and sat at his desk for 20 minutes afterward, unable to speak. He wasn't sure why. The music did something to him for which he had no words. It reached inside his chest and touched something he hadn't known was there. He wasn't the only one. The music spread The music spread through the capital like wildfire. Copies of human files were unofficially passed between analysts, students, scientists, and curious citizens. Within 2 weeks, Beethoven was playing in public spaces on Vioran Prime. Within 3 weeks, human composers Bach, Mozart, and a group called Pink Floyd were being discussed in academic journals. Within a month, a Chalite philosopher published an article arguing that human music represented the most complex system of emotional communication ever developed by any species in the galaxy. But music was only the beginning. The Conclave's literature department received the Human Archive of Fiction and didn't know what to do with it. Other species had stories, of course, creation myths, historical epics, moral fables. Every civilization spawned them, but humans had developed fiction into something no one else could have imagined. They created entire worlds that didn't exist. They wrote stories about people who had never lived in places that had never been, facing problems that had never arisen. And they did it with such skill and emotional precision that readers from completely foreign species found themselves caring about characters who weren't even real. A Dravati librarian read a human book called Les Miserables. She cried for 3 days. She had never cried before. Dravati didn't cry. Their biology didn't support it, but her body had found a way. A Vioran military strategist read a human book called The Art of War, then read another called All Quiet on the Western Front, and then sat in his office for a long time, contemplating that the same species had produced both works. One was a guide to conducting wars, the other was a plea to stop them. Both were brilliant, both were sincere. The strategist didn't know what to do with a species that could hold both ideas in its head simultaneously. And then there was humor. The galaxy had humor. Every species had some form of it. But human humor was different, such that it was hard to define. It was sharper, it was darker. It was capable of being cruel and kind in a single sentence. Humans joked about death, about suffering, about the meaninglessness of existence. And somehow, these jokes made the darkness smaller, not larger. Chalites, who had no real tradition of humor in their culture, became obsessed with something called stand-up comedy and began holding their own open-mic nights in the capital. They were bad at it, but they kept trying, which in itself was very human. In the middle of all this, a human who would become the unexpected center of the cultural storm arrived on Vioran Prime. Dr. Rena Solvin was a civilian scientist from Prometheus, a xenobiologist who had dedicated her career to studying alien life forms through remote data and had never seen one in person. She was 41. She had curly red hair that she could never tame, and she smiled at everything. She smiled at the architecture. She smiled at the food. She smiled at the aliens who towered over her and could have broken her in half with one hand. She constantly asked questions, not the sharp questions of an investigator, but the enthusiastic questions of a child seeing snow for the first time. The conclave had assigned her a liaison. His name was Tarek. Milani was a young Chalit student studying interspecies communication at the Capital University. He was chosen because he was young enough to be expendable and because no one expected this assignment to be important. He was wrong on both counts. Tarek met Dr. Solvin in the diplomatic quarter on his first morning. She was standing in the middle of the street, looking at the crystal towers of the capital with her mouth open. "That is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," she said to him before he could introduce himself. Tarek didn't know how to respond. The crystal towers were old. Everyone on Vioran Prime had seen them 1,000 times. No one considered them beautiful anymore. They were just there, like the sky or the earth. "Those are administrative buildings," he said. "I know," she said, still looking up, "but look at how the light moves through them, as if they were alive." He looked at the towers. He had walked past them every day for 6 years. He had never looked at the light moving through them. Now he looked. She was right. It was beautiful. This happened again and again in the days that followed. Solvin saw beauty in things no one ever noticed. She found the patterns in the scaly markings of Chalits mesmerizing and spent an hour sketching them in a small notebook she carried everywhere. She tried Vioran street food and made sounds of such enthusiastic pleasure that the vendor gave her extra portions for free. She found that Dravati elders hummed to themselves when they thought, and she would stand next to one of them for 20 minutes, just listening, with an expression of complete peace on her face. Tarek found her baffling. She was a member of a species that had built weapons capable of destroying worlds, and she took joy in street food. She was from a fleet of warships that could crush the Empire, and she drew patterns of scales in a notebook. It didn't make sense. On the 5th day, Solvin gave him a small device. It was a rectangular object the size of a hand with one button and a small speaker. "This is a music player," she said. "I've uploaded some things that I think you'll like." Tarek took it to his room that evening and pressed the button. The first composition that played was Beethoven's 9th Symphony, the 4th movement, Ode to Joy. He sat on his bed and listened. At first, he didn't understand what he was hearing. The sounds were strange. Chalit music, of which there was little, was rhythmic and sharp, like the clicking of scales. This was different. It was layered. It grew. It started quietly, and then it swelled, adding voices and instruments, each of which intertwined with the others until the sound became so full that it seemed impossible that all of it could fit into such a small speaker. And then the human voices appeared, singing not in a language he understood, but that didn't matter. The voices carried something beyond words. They carried joy, not the small, safe joy of a pleasant day or tasty food. This was the joy that was forged in suffering. It was the joy of a species that had known darkness and had stubbornly, defiantly decided to sing anyway. Tarek didn't realize he was crying until the tears reached his mandibles. Chalits didn't cry often. It wasn't just as the Dravhati librarian had cried over the human novel, something in the music bypassed all cultural and biological barriers and spoke directly to something deeper, something universal. He listened to it again and again. He listened to it 7 times that night and didn't sleep. The next morning, he found Solvin in her usual spot, looking at the crystal towers. "Why?" he asked her. It was the only word he could manage. She looked at him. She understood the question. "Because we feel everything," she simply said. "Every emotion, all the time, simultaneously. Joy and grief and rage and love and fear. We can't turn any of it off. So, we learn to put it into things. Music, stories, paintings, dance. That's how we survive ourselves." Tarek thought about this. He thought about a species that felt everything so intensely that they had to invent art just to keep from being destroyed by their own emotions. And then he thought about the same species that built Prometheus, built 300 dreadnoughts, built weapons capable of splitting worlds. They built both with the same passion, the same intensity, the same desperate need to bring into reality what they felt. That was what the Empire hadn't expected. The warship was terrifying. The fleet was terrifying. The technology was terrifying. But none of that was as unsettling as the realization that the creatures who built all these things were the same creatures who wrote symphonies, novels, and poems about love, loss, and the beauty of a sunset. The galaxy had seen powerful species. It had never before seen a species that was powerful and beautiful at the same time. Counselor Vet's school felt his coalition crumbling. It was hard to convince people to go to war against a species when that species' music was playing in every square of the capital. It was hard to call them monsters when their stories made people cry from recognition and their humor made people laugh until they lost consciousness. Every day, the cultural exchange undermined the wall of fear that school had built. He became desperate. On the 31st day after first contact, school made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He secretly met with a group of radical military officers from the Empire's border territories. These weren't members of the conclave. These were men and women who believed that the Empire's survival required action, not discussions. School provided them access to old data from the Sol system, the same data that Silent Observer had collected 197 years ago. Humans have shown us their fleet, School said, but a fleet must have a home. Strike the home, and the fleet becomes a group of orphans with nowhere to return to. Their home world is one planet. One planet. Destroy it, and this problem will disappear forever. It was genocide disguised as strategy. The officers agreed. They assembled a stealth fleet of 200 ships taken from reserve forces in the outer territories, ships that wouldn't be noticed immediately. They equipped them with the most powerful weapons available and programmed the navigation systems. Using the old data, the fleet jumped toward Sol, arrived on the edge of the solar system, and immediately dropped out of subspace, ready to begin the approach to the third planet from the star, ready to end the human threat forever. They found something waiting for them. Earth was surrounded by a defensive grid. 10,000 autonomous weapon platforms hung in orbit around the planet and throughout the inner solar system. They were arranged in overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible vector of approach. Each platform was roughly the size of an Imperial frigate, and each carried weapons that the stealth fleet's sensors couldn't fully identify, but whose energy signatures suggested they were capable of splitting a planet's crust. 10,000 of them. The stealth fleet had barely completed its transition from subspace when all the platforms simultaneously oriented toward them. 200 ships detected in less than a second. Targets locked in less than 2. And then, through all the communications channels of the stealth fleet, a message played. It was automatic. It didn't sound evil or threatening. It was calm and clear, like a recorded announcement on a subway station. You are seen. You are welcome to leave. You will be given no further warnings. 200 ships hung in the darkness at the edge of an alien solar system. 200 captains looked at their sensor displays and saw 10,000 weapon platforms aimed directly at them. The math was simple. The math was final. They turned back. Each ship engaged its subspace drives and jumped away. Not one of them fired a shot. Not one of them even thought about it. You don't fight 10,000 automated weapon platforms with 200 ships. You don't fight them with 2,000 ships. You don't fight them at all. School received the news in his private quarters on Vioran Prime. The fleet had returned. They hadn't fired a single shot. He sat in his chair and stared at the wall, and finally understood what Ambassador Zhao had meant. Humans hadn't shown the Conclave everything. They had shown the Conclave their fleet, their dreadnoughts, their offensive power. What they hadn't shown was their defensive power, because the defensive grid around Earth wasn't in the data crystal. 10,000 platforms hadn't been mentioned in the technical description. The humans had given the Empire their sword to study. They had kept their shield a secret, and the shield was bigger than the sword. Somewhere on Vioran Prime, in a public garden near the university, Tarek sat on a bench with his music player and listened to Beethoven for the 43rd time. The sun was setting, and the crystal towers caught the light in the way Solvin had taught him to see. He didn't know about the stealth fleet. He didn't know about the defensive grid. He didn't know that the galaxy had been just minutes away from a war that would have destroyed everything. He just sat, listened to the music, watched the light, and thought about a species that could feel everything simultaneously and somehow survived it. He thought they were perhaps the bravest species he had ever heard of. Not because of their ships, weapons, or shields, but because of the music. Because despite everything, despite the fear and the darkness and the knowledge that the universe was huge, cold, and didn't care about them, they had still found a way to sing. Counselor Vet's Skull stood in the center of the conclave chamber in chains. These were not physical chains. Viorans didn't use physical restraints on their own. The chains were ceremonial strips of dull, gray metal that hung loosely from his wrists and clinked softly when he moved. They were a symbol. They told everyone in the chamber that this man had been judged and found guilty, and that everything he said next would be the last thing he said as a free person. Skull didn't look broken, and he stood straight. His bronze scales caught the chamber's amber light, and his eyes were clear and firm. He had initiated an unauthorized military strike on a sovereign world. He had assembled a secret fleet. He had committed attempted genocide. The evidence was beyond doubt. His own officers had testified against him. Speaker Orff read the charges in his slow, ancient voice. Each fell into the chamber's silence like a stone dropped into deep water. Unauthorized mobilization of imperial military assets. Conspiracy to commit acts of war without conclave approval. Attempted destruction of a sovereign homeworld. Violation of neutral corridor agreements. When the charges were read, Skull was given the right to speak. It was tradition. Every convicted person was allowed a last word. He looked around the chamber. 1,000 faces looked at him. Some were angry, some were sad, some were afraid, but not of him. They were afraid because, on some level, they knew that what he had tried to do came from the same fear that lived in all of them. He was just the one who was foolish enough to act on it. "I have no regrets," Skull said. His voice was steady. "I will not apologize for trying to protect this empire. You can call me a criminal, you can call me a warmonger, you can lock me away until my scales turn to dust. But I want you to remember one thing." He paused. He looked directly at Speaker Orff. 200 years ago, they were primitives. They hadn't even left their world. In 200 years, they built a fleet that can destroy us. 200 years. He let the words hang in the air. You sit here, celebrating peace and listening to their music and reading their stories, and you don't ask the main question, who will they become in another 200 years? In 500? In 1,000? The chamber was quiet. "You don't understand who they are," Skull said. And for the first time, in his voice appeared something that wasn't anger, it was genuine, honest horror. "They are not a species, they are a force. They don't stop. They don't plateau. They don't reach a level and stop there, like any other civilization in this galaxy. They keep going, they keep building, they keep evolving. And one day, whether in 100 years or 1,000, they will be so far ahead of us that we will be to them what insects are to us." He looked around the chamber one last time. "I tried to stop it," Skull said. "I failed." He screamed, "And you will all live long enough to wish that I hadn't." He said nothing more. The guards led him away. The chamber remained silent for a long time after he left, because he was right. Everyone knew he was right, not about the genocide. That was monstrous, and no one in the chamber would defend him. But the question he had asked was real, and sat in the center of the room like a crack in the floor that everyone was trying to walk around. Who would humans become in another 200 years? It was Speaker Orff who finally broke the silence. He slowly rose from his seat. His ancient tree-like bark creaked, and he spoke in the voice of a person who had lived long enough to know that fear was the worst foundation for making a decision. "Counselor Skull asked the right question," Orff said. "Who will humans become? I do not know. None of us can know. But I know one thing. The answer to that question depends on what we do next. If we treat them as enemies, they will become enemies. If we try to contain them, they will break out and remember that we tried. If we ignore them, they will grow above us in the dark, just as they did before." He looked around the chamber. "Or, we can do something this empire hasn't done in 12,000 years. We can treat another species as an equal. Not because we have to, not because they forced us, but because it is right. And because the alternative is a future where the most powerful species in the galaxy remembers that we tried to destroy their home." The chamber stirred. Orff raised one branch-like hand for silence. "Ambassador Zhao has asked to address the conclave once more. I think we should listen to her." Elena Zhao approached the center of the chamber for the second time. She looked different than she had during her first address. Not older, exactly, but more tired. The weeks since first contact had been long for everyone, including the humans. She had spent those weeks in meetings, negotiations, arguments, and late nights that had blurred into a single, exhausting stretch of time, but her eyes remained clear and her back straight. And when she spoke, her voice still carried the quiet, authoritative sound of a person who knew exactly what she was going to say and why it mattered. I listened to the words of Counselor School, she said. And I want to tell you something that might surprise you. He is not wrong. The chamber fell silent. Humanity will continue to evolve, Zhao said. We will develop new technologies. We will expand. We will grow. It is our nature. It is what we have always done. We cannot stop it any more than you can stop a river from flowing downhill. In another 200 years, yes, we will almost certainly be stronger than we are today. Counselor School is right about that. She paused. But he is wrong about what that means. Because power is not the same thing as intent. A knife can slice bread, and it can slice flesh. The knife does not choose. The hand that holds it chooses. And we are here today to tell you what we choose. She reached into her uniform and pulled out a second data crystal. It was smaller than the first and glowed with a warm golden light instead of blue. This contains a formal proposal from the tyrant United Government. We call it the Galactic Pact. She held up the crystal so the chamber could see it. This is not a treaty of submission. We will never submit to anyone again, and we will never ask you to submit to us. This is not a convenience alliance that we will abandon when it ceases to serve our interests. This is a pact, a promise, a binding agreement between equals. She placed the crystal on the podium before her. The terms are simple. Humanity will share its technologies with every signatory species freely and without conditions. Our fusion reactors, our shield systems, our medical advances. Everything we have built in 200 years of fear and resolve, we will give away. Any species that signs the pact will have access to everything we know. A murmur of disbelief rolled through the chamber. Zhao waited for it to pass. Furthermore, humanity commits its military forces to the defense of any signatory species that is attacked. An attack on one will be considered an attack on all. No species in this pact will ever face a threat alone. She paused again. This was the moment she had been building toward. The room felt it. In return, we ask for one thing, she said. She looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as she could. Never again catalog a species as being beneath you. The words were simple, they were quiet, and they hit the chamber like a physical force. No more level 9 classifications, Zhao said. No more surveying a world and recording primitives in a file and walking away. No more looking down at a species that hasn't left its planet yet and deciding they don't matter because we were that species, and we were the ones who were in the file, and we remember what that felt like. Her voice didn't shake, it didn't rise. It remained just as it was calm, clear, and confident. Every species matters. Every world matters. Every civilization that is struggling to light its first fire or launch its first rocket matters because you don't know who they will become. You didn't know who we would become. And if we had been less lucky, if we hadn't found that probe, we might still be on Earth, looking at the stars and wondering why no one had ever come back. She moved away from the podium. That is our proposal. Technology, protection, partnership in exchange for the promise that this galaxy will never again treat a young species as something that can be recorded in a file and forgotten. That is what humanity wants. That is all we have ever wanted. Speaker Orf was silent for a moment. The amber light of the chamber moved slowly across his tree-like bark, and his ancient eyes were moist with something for which the Dravati had no word. Finally, he spoke. Ambassador Zhao, you come from a species that feared us. You built weapons that could destroy everything we built in 12,000 years. And now you stand before us and offer to give all that away. Forgive an old man for asking, but I must understand why. Why would you give up the very advantage that makes you untouchable? Zhao smiled. It was a small smile, tired, real, and warm. Because we were the ones looking at the sky, she said, frightened and alone, wondering, does anyone care if we live or die? We spent 200 years building a wall around ourselves because we had no choice. But a wall keeps you safe, and it also keeps you alone. We are tired of being alone, Speaker. We are tired of being afraid. She looked up at the huge crystal ceiling of the chamber. We built all of this so we could stand here today and say, the wall is open. Come in. We will keep you safe. And in return, we ask you to do the same for everyone who comes after us. That is the deal. That is the fact. The vote was not unanimous. 17 species voted against the pact. Most of them were allies of School's faction or species whose pride wouldn't allow them to accept gifts from a civilization that had been classified as primitive within living memory. But the majority was overwhelming. 83 species voted in favor. The Galactic Pact was signed in the amber light of the conclave chamber. And when it was done, Speaker Orf and Ambassador Zhao shook hands in the center of the room, and the chamber erupted with a sound that hadn't been heard there for a very long time. Applause. Not polite, formal applause. Real applause. The kind that comes from relief and hope, and the feeling that, perhaps, everything might get better than it had been. The news spread through the galaxy like light. In the months that followed, everything changed. Human engineers arrived on 100 worlds, sharing fusion technology with species that had used plasma reactors for millennia. Medical teams brought cures for diseases that had plagued alien civilizations for centuries. Agricultural scientists helped terraform barren moons into gardens. Educational specialists developed interspecies curricula that allowed children from different worlds to learn together. And humans continued to evolve. School was right about that. They didn't stop. Within the first year of the Pact, human researchers had already developed improvements to their own fusion reactors, and they immediately shared those improvements. Within 3 years, they solved a problem in the field of subspace physics that had puzzled Empire scientists for 800 years and published the solution openly, free for all. But something else happened, too, that no one had predicted, not even the humans themselves. Other species began to evolve, too. The impact of human creativity, human problem-solving, human persistence, and the refusal to accept the impossible was contagious. Vioran scientists who hadn't published original research in centuries began experimenting again. Chelit engineers, content with existing designs, began pushing boundaries. Dravati philosophers, comfortable in traditional comfort, began asking uncomfortable questions. The galaxy was waking up not because humanity forced it, but because humanity reminded it of something it had forgotten. That the universe is full of mysteries and solving them is the most exciting thing a thinking creature can do. 50 years passed. On a space station hovering between 3 star systems in a region of space that had once been the neutral corridor, a university was built. It was one of the first institutions created under the Galactic Pact, and it grew into the largest learning center in the galaxy. Students from every signatory species attended classes together, ate together, argued, and laughed, and struggled together. Professor Tarek of the Chelits stood before a lecture hall in the central campus of the university. He was old. His carapace had shifted from the smooth, dark brown of youth to a lighter, cracked pattern showing his age. He moved slower than before and used a cane made from a piece of Dravati heartwood that a friend had given him a decade ago. But his mind remained sharp, and his mandibles still clicked as if he were thinking. His class was full. 40 students from 8 different species sat in curved rows of seats. Each looked at him with that special attention students give a professor known for telling stories rather than reading from textbooks. Among them were Viorans, Chelits, Dravati, 2 representatives of a new species called the Karats who had been raised under the Pact just 15 years ago, and 7 humans. Tarek looked at all of them and felt what he had learned to call by the human word, gratitude. Today, he said, I will tell you a story. It is a story about the day everything changed. Some of you have heard parts of it before. Some of you have read about it in your history textbooks, but none of you were there, and I was. So you will hear it from me. He tapped his cane on the floor once, which was his way of getting everyone's full attention. 50 years ago, I was a student. I was young, bored, and didn't think there was anything surprising left in the universe. And then one day, a sensor officer on a border station discovered something in the neutral corridor, something that shouldn't have been there, something that didn't match any known species in the Imperial database. He paused. The sensor officer's name was Tylan Vasquez. He was a good officer, careful, precise. He did what any good officer would do when seeing meaningless readings. He smiled again. It was a Chelit smile, which meant his mandibles slightly parted and his eyes narrowed, but the humans in the room could read it perfectly. He checked the readings twice, Tarek said, and they didn't change, because the ship that was in the neutral corridor was real. It was called Prometheus, and it belonged to a species that the Empire had catalogued as pre-spaceflight primitives less than 200 years before. He gave them time to ponder that. Humans did what no one thought possible. In the time it takes most civilizations to make minor improvements to existing technologies, they went from burning fossil fuels to creating the most powerful warship the galaxy had ever seen. They did it in secret. They did it in the dark. And they did it because they were afraid. He looked at the human students in the room. They looked at him calmly. They had grown up in a galaxy where humans were respected and admired, and sometimes still feared, but they hadn't grown up in the dark. And they hadn't grown up looking at the stars and wondering if something out there wanted to destroy them. That was the gift their grandparents had given them. But here is the part of the story I want you to remember, he said. Humans could have used their power to conquer. They could have burned the Empire's worlds and taken everything they wanted. No one could have stopped them. They knew it. We knew it. And for a while, the entire galaxy held its breath, waiting to see what the humans would do. He picked up a small object from his desk. It was old and worn. The casing was scratched and faded. A small rectangular device with one button and a tiny speaker. A music player, the same one that Dr. Rena Solvin had given him 50 years ago. What did they do? Tarek said. They played us a song. He pressed the button, and the tiny speaker crackled. And then the first notes of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony filled the lecture hall. It was tiny and thin coming from the old speaker, but that didn't matter. Music was music. It hadn't changed in hundreds of years, and it wouldn't change in hundreds of years. Humans were never the monsters we feared, he said over the music. They were frightened children who had built a fortress and then opened the door. They were a species that felt everything so deeply that they had to invent art just to survive their own hearts. They were the ones who looked at the darkness and decided to sing. He let the music play for a moment. The lecture hall was very quiet. Some students were crying. The Karats, who were new to human music, froze completely, and their large, dark eyes were full of something for which they didn't yet have words, but which they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. That is the story, Tarek said. It is a story about how one ship changed the galaxy, not with its weapons, not with its shields, not with its impossible reactor. It changed the galaxy because the people inside it decided to be bigger than their fear. He turned off the music player and carefully set it down. Class dismissed. The students gathered their things and left. Tarek stood at the front of the empty room and listened to the silence, remembering the day 50 years ago when he had sat on a bench in the garden on Vioran Prime and listened to Beethoven for the first time and hadn't understood why he was crying. Now he understood. As the last students left the room, a human girl with dark hair and bright eyes lingered by the door. She was sitting next to a Vioran classmate, a young male with green scales who was carefully transcribing the lecture. The human girl leaned toward him and whispered, "Actually, we also built a very, very big gun," she said. "Just in case." The Vioran student looked at her, then laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from the gut and shakes the shoulders and makes the person next to you laugh, too. The human girl smirked. They walked out together into the wide corridor of the university station, where students of 8 species were heading to their next classes, to the cafeteria, or to the observation deck where one could watch the sunset of 3 suns simultaneously. The corridor was noisy with voices in a dozen languages. And somewhere far away, someone was playing human music on a speaker, and somewhere else a Shalit student was trying to tell a joke he had heard from a human friend. He got the timing wrong, but everyone was laughing anyway. The galaxy wasn't perfect. It never would be. There were still disagreements and tensions, and species that didn't trust each other, and old wounds that hadn't fully healed. But it was better. It was much better than it had been. And it all started with one ship, one reading on a sensor display that didn't make sense. A sensor officer who checked the numbers twice, and a species that was afraid of the dark and decided, against all logic, against all probability, to light a fire so bright that the entire galaxy saw it. Prometheus was a museum ship now. It hovered in orbit above the university station, preserved exactly as it had been on the day it entered the neutral corridor. Students visited it on field trips. They walked its corridors, touched its hull, and tried to imagine what it was like to be on board on that first day, when the entire galaxy was an unknown, and the only thing separating humanity from oblivion was the ship beneath their feet. On the observation deck of Prometheus, there was a plaque. It had been installed by Captain Lena Vasquez on the day the ship was decommissioned. It was simple, just a few words engraved on steel, because humans had always loved steel. Even after they learned to build from crystals and light, the plaque read, "We were afraid. We built this. Terminus, the crew of the UNS Prometheus, on behalf of humanity." Below the plaque, someone had taped a small, handwritten note. No one knew who had put it there or when. It had lain there for years, and no one removed it. On the note was written, "P.S. The guns still work." And far down below the station, the stars burned as they always had, as they always would, but they didn't look the way they had before. They didn't look cold, distant, and indifferent anymore. They looked like a neighborhood. And humanity, finally, after all those years of fear and silence and building in the dark, had finally arrived.